And so leaving off this week, I want to come back and talk about the UFC. And I think that actually for the next little while, I think that that's how I'm going to, to organize most of these podcasts, is that I'm going to start off talking about hockey, and then I'll finish talking about the UFC. There's going to be a lot of UFC stuff to talk about because I have looked into the future down the road at some of the UFC cards coming up, and they have some absolutely massive cards coming up. But the one that's coming up on this particular upcoming Saturday is going to be Overeem versus Alexander Volkov. So in Alistair Overeem, we're talking about the number 5 ranked heavyweight in the world, matching up against, in Alexander Volkov, the number 6 ranked heavyweight. And the stakes for this one are very, very high. Because I personally think that whoever does win this fight is probably going to be no more than 2 fights away from a UFC heavyweight championship fight. I mean, make no mistake about it, there are a lot of moving parts there. I mean, in particular, there's Stipe Miocic's upcoming defense against Francis Ngannou, which is going to be an absolutely massive card. I mean, I won't go into all the details right now, but that card is stacked to the ceiling. But even beyond that, there's the UFC's next heavyweight main event between Derek Lewis and Curtis Blades, and as I understand it, the general line of thinking is that whoever comes out of that fight is most likely going to be the next person in line for a chance at Stipe's championship. Unless, of course, the UFC does manage to finally get something on paper for John Jones to do, in which case, John Jones, he could intercede in this particular situation at any time. But unless that happens, you would have to think that in most likely the next contender after Ngannou in this upcoming fight in March, you would have to look to it and say that probably the next contender to get a shot at Stipe is going to be the winner of the Blades and Lewis fight. But then after that, probably most likely the next person, if not Rosenstrike, is going to be the winner of Alistair Overeem and Alexander Volkov. So make no mistake about it, the stakes in this fight are sky high. I mean, in particular for Alistair Overeem, who, I have to be honest with you, we just have to face the facts. As fantastic a career as he has had, Alistair Overeem is just not getting any younger. And while he doesn't really look like he is necessarily the worse for wear, this is a sport that has a curfew. And so on top of that, there's one other issue that's kind of facing Alistair Overeem in this particular fight. And that is what I would kind of look at as a glass ceiling that is basically formed over top of him. 2018 was the last time that Alistair Overeem was ranked any higher than number 5. And that was almost 3 years ago. And so right now, at age 40, I think that we have to conclude that Alistair Overeem is right now in the middle of what would almost have to be his final push for a UFC heavyweight championship of the world. If anything happens to arrest his momentum at this particular point, I think that that might be the end of his championship aspirations. So for Alistair Overeem, right now is the time. He has to push this thing to the moon. Or maybe think about calling it a career. Now, I'm not the first person to ever say something like that, to say that Alistair Overeem is either done or that he's on his way to being done. And with any luck, I will not be the last person to ever say it. Because, of course, what that would mean is that Alistair Overeem's gone on to continue to have a very vibrant and successful career as an MMA fighter. And so I do think that with that in mind, I think that we do have to ask ourselves exactly what it is that has allowed Alistair Overeem to turn his career around at so many different junctures. When people thought that he was done, and he continued to turn around and pick up momentum and get himself back into a contending position, what was it that Alistair Overeem did that allowed him to do that? And this is going to sound like a perverse phrase, but just hear me out on this. Because I think that if you actually look at it, Alistair Overeem is probably one of the MMA fighters that has been one of the most successful losers in sport history. Not to say that Alistair Overeem is a loser, because of course he isn't. You look at his record, and such a thing would be absolutely absurd to say. So what I mean by that specifically is that Alistair Overeem is perhaps one of the fighters that has managed to best galvanize himself after a defeat, and use a defeat in the octagon to actually make him a better fighter in the long run. I mean, as Chael Sonnen has put it, if there is one word that you could use to describe Alistair Overeem, that word is survivor. And he's not a guy that dwells on his losses. He does not go away. He's a guy that comes back and he wins. He's very seldom in his career has he ever lost 2 fights in a row. And almost never has he lost 3 in a row. He's not a guy that goes away. He doesn't dwell on a fight and he doesn't go away. He comes back and he wins again. Looking over his record, very seldom in his career has he ever lost more than 1 fight in a row. On only a few occasions has he ever lost 2 in a row, and almost never has he ever lost 3 in a row. And it seems like there isn't anything that's off the table after a loss for Alistair Overeem. After he lost to Rosenstrike, the very first thing that he did was he went off to actually train with Rosenstrike. To actually go off, despite being an older, more experienced fighter than Rosenstrike, to actually go and basically study at the guy's feet for a few months, to learn exactly what it was that Rosenstrike did that allowed him to beat him. That's something that there are a lot of fighters out there, they're not very good at swallowing their pride and doing something like that. And much to Rosenstrike's credit, there are a lot of fighters out there that would never let that guy in the gym with them to train with them, to go learn how he beat them, knowing that it is entirely possible, in fact probable, that at some point they are going to end up across the octagon from each other again. That is a glowing statement on Rosenstrike's sportsmanship and about his dedication to the sport. That he's willing to put aside his personal interests to help a guy that will eventually end up across the octagon for him, possibly fighting him for a chance at the World Heavyweight Championship, to put everything aside to actually help that guy become a better fighter. It says tremendous things about Rosenstrike's character. But there is one other factor to consider, and that is, when you think about it, Rosenstrike actually owes Alistair Overeem a little bit of a debt himself. Because Alistair Overeem, he was something of what you would call a pioneer in MMA. There was a point in recent history, probably a lot more recent than a lot of people would remember, but there was a point in recent history where a lot of people actually were very convinced that kickboxing was not a discipline that was going to take somebody very far in MMA. And who was one of the first guys to break in and change that, well in advance of guys like Rosenstrike and Israel Adesanya? Well, it was, in fact, Alistair Overeem. And of course, in order to do that, Alistair Overeem, he didn't come in as what you would call a pure kickboxer. He went away and he learned himself one very good submission, and he used it to tremendous advantage. And so, of course, we're talking about that guillotine choke that he has so famously used to win in so many different situations. But would Rosenstrike be in the UFC today without Alistair Overeem having paved the way for him? Well, I think that we have to maybe conclude that I think that a fighter like Rosenstrike, he would have gotten in eventually. Would he be in the UFC now? Now, that's a very different question. If not for Overeem, who knows? Perhaps Adesanya might have had to have been the person to come in and pave that, and blaze that trail for other kickboxers. But he probably wouldn't be where he is now if it wasn't for Overeem having come in and blazed that trail in advance of him. So let's not for so much as one moment underestimate the importance of Alistair Overeem to the history of MMA. He has been a tremendously important fighter. And so not only has Alistair Overeem been very important to fighters trained as kickboxers in MMA history, coming back to that history of how he deals with a defeat and how he comes back from a defeat better than he ever was before, is also another very valuable skill that a lot of fighters that are out there looking to follow the trail that he blazed. There's a lot of fighters out there that need to get in touch with that particular ability.